Good morning, everybody. Very excited about the events today. We have Dr. Claire Pomeroy here today, which is always great, from the Lasker Foundation. Reg Kelly, it's really an honor to have you here. And I'm going to invite Claire up to give a nice introduction before your presentation. So Claire.
Well, thank you, Tom, and on behalf of Lasker and the partners, welcome to all of you. I think we're in for a very exciting, informative day. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Reg Kelly to you. He has an amazing career, and you're going to hear about that today. And it may change your career paths when you get all excited about all the different options that are out there. Reg is Executive Director of Qb3. Who knows what Qb3 is? Reg, okay, by the end of this talk, you will all be able to raise your hands. Qb3 is a group of scientists on 3 of the University of California campuses who work at the interface between the physical and the life sciences. And what an area for convergence and innovation there. And their goal is to convert discoveries into practical benefits for society, which is something that so many of us want to do, right? The power of science, and use it to address social needs. And so that's what you'll hear about today. He has launched 2 Qb3 associated companies. Qb3 at 953 is a life sciences startup incubator. So you can all find out about that. And he also started a venture fund called Mission Bay Capital, which has actually taken off, been quite successful. And so he's kind of working on both ends of things here, the money and the science. Dr. Kelly is the Senior Advisor on Innovation and Entrepreneurship to UC President Napolitano. He is an expert in molecular and cellular neurobiology, and you can see up on the slide that in addition to his PhD, he is actually an OBE, meaning that, and this is for all our British counterparts out there, right? He was appointed in 2014 as an officer of the Order of the British Empire, so he's OBE, for his service to science, innovation, and global health. Reg, we are so honored to have you speak to us today. Looking forward to your comments.
Well, thank you all for coming this morning. I don't give talks like this very often, but for me it was a very good opportunity to go back and think, well, why am I here? Why did I get here, right? And so I'm going to go through a little bit what the logic was, why I was a standard, common or garden molecular biologist ending up running a venture fund and doing things like that. So let me just try and go through and give you some background. So I'm going to talk this morning particularly about academia and the private sector and why I got involved with this. So I think for almost all of us, what really gets most of us going is a belief that we love knowledge, right? And for me, it's almost a religion, that the fact that makes humans so particularly special, particularly if you're not religious, is to think that we are perhaps the only form of matter in the universe that can understand the universe and understand where we came from. It gives us a unique capacity it makes humans a particularly unique form of life, a form of matter in the whole universe. As far as we know, there's nothing like us anywhere. And so this pursuit of knowledge, I think, is what makes us all incredibly special. Now, one of the things that, therefore, it leads very much to universities. Universities are such an amazing cultural institution throughout the world, right? How it is, places where we acquire knowledge, we study knowledge, we process that knowledge. Most of us love the universities, and I love universities dearly, because I think if you love knowledge, universities are sort of the meccas of knowledge. Now, in fact, it's so nice being on the things. It's very tempting to withdraw off into your little ivory tower and just hang out with your colleagues and just have such fun studying knowledge. Now, that unfortunately doesn't work, right? So nowadays, because it's one of the sad facts, throughout America, every public university is in trouble right now. Every public university is getting less and less funding from their state governments. My UCSF, where I work, gets only 4% of its budget now from the state of California. And this isn't just in this country. In Britain, as you know, they're having troubles. If you go around Asia, perhaps with the exception of China, almost every country is now trying to worry about how their public universities will survive. And these are the research universities. You know, teaching universities, everyone knows you need workforce development. But research universities are really challenged. And the trouble is, we want to do our research, and we need to have the government to pay for it, right? So this is what happens, you know, the government takes lots of money from the taxpayers. However, they have all sorts of demands on that money. They've got to put money into schools, they've got to put it into healthcare, they've got to put it into pensions. When the legislators see someone, oh, we also need money for research universities, you can see why it's pretty far down on their priority list, right? They're not really trying to think about how things. So I think that what this means is that we want public universities to survive. Excuse me. It's early in the morning for me. Yeah, if we want public universities to survive, we've got to think hard about this. Now, the usual attitude is keep calm and get back to the ivory tower. But I think we can't do that. That's what I think many of my academic colleagues say, oh, it'll all blow over, don't worry about it. But I actually think we've got to think about it differently. It's a social contract involved. If we take money from taxpayers, they're not particularly interested in whether we get papers in science and nature. They're not particularly interested in getting Lasker Awards or Nobel Prizes. They want to see some benefits back to themselves. And we had that obligation. It's not just it's a responsibility to pay attention to the social contract. Now, I would argue that universities are ideal places for taking on the grand challenges of society. A grand challenge is one that used to be called wicked problems, you know, a problem that you can't solve unless you bring people together with different experiential backgrounds. And so in universities having this diversity of talent are ideal for addressing huge challenges like poverty, mental depression, and aging, right? Now, one of the things, once you see where your logic leads you now, all right, you realize you're going to have to give back to society if you want to get research money. Now, there's no way you can do that just as a university, right? Universities don't provide products. We don't provide services. We must partner with the private sector. Now that why I'm stressing that so much is I hear a lot from my colleagues saying, oh, you're contaminating the beauty of science, you know, wonderful fundamental research. Now I believe in fundamental research as much as anyone. I spent my whole life doing it, but because of this social contract thing, I believe we must interact with the private sector. Now the trouble is they're an odd couple, right? And the reason we're an odd couple, if you think about how we in academia think about business, we say, oh, all they're interested in is money. And if you talk to people in the industry, they'll say, oh, the worst thing about academics is they're a cross between the Vatican and the British monarchy and the way they do things. And they've got far too much of an interest in just getting papers out and getting prizes. So you have these two groups with different attitudes to a cultural difference. So if you want to bring people together, you've got to try and think about how you can do that, right? And as I say, it's an obligation. It's not a choice. So this is where Qb3 comes in. In the year 2000, which was the last time there was a lot of money in the state of California, they created these 4 institutes of science and innovation. Each of us got $100 million to start our institutions. And Qb3 was the only one in the life sciences. But one of our mandates were created by the legislature, not by the university, by the legislature, with the idea that we would try and do something to help the economy of California, right? By creating in this area. Now that's not surprising. Like, we're a state university, land-grant university, and that's, excuse me, why they were created. They were created, excuse me. They were created in order to help the local Californians. So, so what we did, so Qb3, as Claire mentioned, we're 3 campuses, Berkeley, UCSF, and UC Santa Cruz. And part of what we do is just the usual thing that one does in academia. You do research and education try to bring together, though, we do it across boundaries. So I try and bring the physical scientists and the engineers in contact with the biological sciences. By the way, this whole convergence idea, I don't think is very new, right? I was a physicist coming into biology many decades ago, so we just keep recycling the old ideas. So one of the things, though, that was different is that we also had Qb3 Innovation Services, which interacted with the private sector. And it turns out when you're doing with the private sector, you really have to think about it in two groups. You partner with the big established companies and you do startups. How you do those things are really quite different. But what we found very quickly was that, in fact, that we actually found most benefit in connecting the startups to the companies, right? So being a liaison group to make the startups associate with established companies was useful. And the goal here was to achieve public good. All right. Now, so let's first of all talk about interactions with the big companies. I'm not going to spend much time on this because this isn't, there are not many people here. So you would think that many people here who are interested from business. So what is happening, of course, in the pharmaceutical industry right now is they're reducing the number of research employees, right? They're laying them off because they find it's much easier to get their new things by acquiring small companies. So big pharma is looking around to try and so that means, of course, they're interested in getting small companies. Now, why would they, though, involve... so they're shrinking, but why partner with universities? Now, this is a little, perhaps not so involved with this group, but it's actually a challenge, right? Any big pharmas have all these business development officers. They're going to all meetings. They're looking for people who are knowledgeable on the universities. And if they do, they will make a partnership with that faculty member or with that lab, right? And of course, there's a whole lot of things that come up and restrictions on that, but that's a negotiation between a faculty member and a company. Right? Now, here what I'm interested in talking about, what's the interaction between a university? Why should any company get interacting with the whole university when it can just pick off the faculty members it needs? And that's a challenge. And many universities are going around trying to say, I want to have association with companies, and they haven't really thought through why they're doing it, what the point is, what the logic. So one of the things that, just to mention briefly, what we're doing in Qb3 in this area is arguing what we call the breadboard concept. You know, the breadboards are great if you want to play around making circuits. You have all these transistors, capacitors and stuff on a board, and the output of your breadboard depends on how you wire those things together. Well, I like that as a metaphor for what universities are, right? We have this amazing talent in all these different areas, and you can get all sorts of outputs from a university depending on who you connect and in what form, right? So what Qb3 does is look around our research community, find a particular topic that we think is appropriate for us to do, for example, like fibrosis, right, which we have no department of fibrosis, but find the faculty members who are pertinent to fibrosis, bring them together, build up teams, and then once you've got a team, then you can go out and find an industry partner and saying, we've got this team of people that will interact with you. So this is one of the ways I think universities can make this happen. And the one that we've been working with most closely is with Calico, which is a spin-off of Google. We have a joint partnership with them in the field of longevity. So this whole breadboard approach I was able to sell to Calico, and it's something which is, I think, worth emulating. We're trying to expand this program within the university. But what I really want to do here is to focus on startup formation, because that's where I've put most of my energies. And it makes sense, right? The difference in culture between a university and Merck is enormous. The difference between a university and a startup is very similar, right? Both of us have very little money, you know, we work very hard, and so, and usually, and we're scrappy, we don't have a big hierarchical structures, you know, it's much more a cottage industry in a startup. So it's very easy to migrate from a university into a startup. Now, one of the reasons that we try to push on startups, remember, we were created in Qb3 to help the California economy. Now, this data here, which comes out of the Kaufman Foundation, really quite surprising. You look at where new jobs creation occurs, it's nearly all in a company that's in its first year of existence, right? So if you want to do anything, which we're obliged to do to help the economy of California, by far the best way of doing that is to start new companies, right? Now, the other thing, we of course know that startups come from the university. This is just from local ones. UCSF, my department, gave rise to Genentech with Herb Boyer, and Chiron with Bill Rutter, and these have now become acquired by big things. So universities are very good at starting these companies. So we're good at doing startups. It makes sense to us, and it's good for society. Now here is this is probably the meat and potatoes of the whole thing, and we could spend the next hour going through this thing. So, yeah, it's really great. You got this idea. You want to start your company. You want to be a CEO. You imagine yourself being in your limo with your own driver. But that's far, far away in the future, right? You've really got to get down and think about how you're going to set the company. Now, what we might do later on is come back to this and point out the various, because obviously to go through all of these things would take forever. But this is the sort of things you have to think about. The key importance, say, on personal management, you have to say, why do I want to do this? That's probably the first question and most important one you have to ask. Because if you've made a discovery, right, it can be licensed out to to a company, very often, a big company. You don't have to start a company on it, right? Or you can give your stuff to somebody else. Why do you particularly want to do it? And it's important that becomes an analysis of who you are, who we are as people, because it's for people, particularly I think, who don't like bosses. That's a really good way to go. You know, if you're a little bit tired of working under a PhD advisor or in a postdoctoral fellowship, think, oh, I don't care, I just want to be my own boss. Well, doing your own startups, if that's a big motivation for you, doing a startup is a really good thing to do. Another positive thing about doing a startup is that you can actually decide where you live. You know, many times when you're looking to get a faculty job coming from, say, UCSF, you're very unlikely to get a faculty job at UCSF. You're actually very unlikely to get one in the San Francisco Bay Area. So you end up going out to Nebraska or, you know, Iowa or something like that. You know, well, that's okay. But if you start your company, you can stay in San Francisco, you know, if that's important to you. I hope I'm not offended anyone from Nebraska or Iowa here. I should have said you could go to Scotland. So one of the things, you know, and it's, I think, just about as hard to be an assistant professor as it is to start up a company. It's the same pressures, your own personal insecurity, desperately trying to get money, build up a team. It's a very similar experience to start a company and to be an assistant professor. But if you decide to go this way, you can stay within your city. Now, so some key things there, and I won't go through the details, but one, you've got this gizmo, right, you've invented. You love it. You've spent all your life making it, and so you want to start your company. You've got to think, well, and this is where the hardest part is, who needs it? Who wants one of these, right? And this is, why this is hard is we in the universities do a very poor job of letting people know what the needs are of society. You know, if you go to your professor and ask what's important, if you ask me, I would have said, oh, understanding synaptic transmission, because that's what I did, right? So I wouldn't be able to say, oh, your work would be good for, you know, manic depression or something, because I didn't really know what was important in those areas. So our faculty have no idea, to be honest, about what are the appropriate markets for an invention. So the first thing you have to do when you decide to move out is think, who is going to buy one of these things, right? And then you have to go and find some people you think will buy them and ask them, right? It's customer research. That's pretty essential to go and find out if you made one of those, if they were available, who would buy it. And before you get very far into it, you need to get that established. And then, of course, you say, well, who else, is someone else making a gizmo like mine? You know, so if they are, is my gizmo better? It better be, you know, and if it's cheaper, it better be a lot cheaper because you're going to put all that development costs in to make that happen. And so, or you say, oh, no one's ever bought one of these gizmos ever before. Great, I've got the field to myself. But then you have to create a market, right? You've got to persuade people who've never had one of these gizmos in the world that having a gizmo is going to make their lives better. So even no competition is not a big advantage. Now, the money thing is really, of course, and we'll get back into this, perhaps one of the most important things. We actually, as we run an incubator space. We don't give away anything for free, right? We charge rent, we keep market rates for everyone, because we believe anybody who's going to get into the startup business ought to be able to go and raise the money to get themselves off the ground. If you're not able to go and get some money from the 3 Fs, friends, family, and fools, right? That's a standard condition. That's a standard 3 Fs are well known. If you can't raise that money, you're probably not going to make it as a business person, right? Because you really have to have the capacity to persuade someone that your idea is worthwhile. So you get your company, you've got to incorporate, you've got to choose a name, all that's fairly easy. We'll come into that in a minute. Check whether your intellectual property, freedom to operate. Now, we'll come back a little bit in a moment, how some things you can do with this. And then you get involved with trying to raise money and knowing what sort of sources of money are out there besides their friends, fools, and family. So the difference between angel and venture, and trying to get venture, knowing what venture capitalists are looking for and how you can pitch yourself to those things. And that's actually really important because there's almost, I am on my 3rd venture fund right now. I've probably listened to about 4 pitches a week. I've been doing this for the last 8 years. I have heard an amazing number of companies doing pitches. There's almost a set format for doing that. You get used to it. You better know what that format is and pitch that way. And most of the things in your pitch are going to be that you've covered the things on this checklist here, right? You've done all of that. And so you need help to do this whole thing. Now, one of the things in the life sciences is crucial. It's a very different world if you're life sciences versus making an app for a cell phone, right? An app you're selling to customers. If you're making something in the life sciences space, you've really only got one customer, and that's the government, right? They are the people who are going to decide whether your stuff is going to get approved through the FDA and whether it's going to be reimbursed by Medicare, right? So this is not like making a cell phone. This is actually like making a fighter jet, right? When you've only one customer, namely the government. So you've got to make sure that pathway, that the government is buying your type of fighter jet before you put a lot of time into making it. A very different, so this is what is one of the troubles for people going to innovation classes in most universities. Almost all the universities, of course, are trying innovation in all sorts of IT space and life sciences space. The rules for innovation in life sciences are quite different from those in other things. So if you just take a standard entrepreneurship class, you're spending a lot of time learning stuff that isn't very pertinent to being in the life sciences industry. Another thing that was really important that you think of is, plan B here. Suppose it doesn't work, right? Suppose you go and spend 2 years in getting up your company and it bombs. So let me say, actually, very few companies fail, right? As people say, it's about 90% failure rate. What they mean is only 10% are big successes. The majority of companies, if they're small, they get acquired, right? If you're not doing so well, you're sort of flat, but you've got people, you've got equipment, you have some money in the bank. Another group that's more successful will acquire you, right? So most companies don't just disappear and people close up and go home. In our experience, it's about 10 or 20% do that. Most are moving on to other things. So here, you had this big dream and your idea got bought for a pittance by some other company and you're on the street again. Now, don't despair about that. The one thing that's shortest in all of the field of entrepreneurship just now are people who have had experience in starting companies. Not experience in starting successful companies, but experience in starting companies. So when somebody comes in, so we have all sorts of people who are really smart, they've got great gizmos, great ideas, they've no skills and don't know how to start a company. What is invaluable is to match them up with someone who's actually gone through that experience before. And if you failed twice, it's even better. You've learned more, right? So having people who are serial entrepreneurs are crucial. And so if your plan B is, you'll come up and do it again, and you'll be more valuable the next time. That sounds quite a trivial point, but I always had a discussion with the president of Tsinghua University in China, and we're trying to see why it is that right now life sciences entrepreneurship is not taking off in China, and everyone's a little surprising. It's taking off in other areas, but not in life sciences. What we both thought the likelihood was there's such a lack of serial entrepreneurs in China because it takes a while to build up a group of people with that type of experience. So your plan B, if you fail, is okay. You're actually going to be more valuable for your next one, and people will be looking very hard to try and get your company. It's also very important to think about what you want to do with your company, this exit strategy. Remember, venture capitalists, people give them a rough time, but they have to try to get the most money they can out of your company, right? They have to do that because as I go and raise money for my venture funds, the only way I can get people to invest in me is I say, I'm going to try and get you profit on those things. So I've made a commitment to them to make that money. If I don't do that for them, I'll never do it again, right? That's going to be the end of myself as a venture capitalist. So venture capitalists, when they come in, they're going to want to get the most money out of you they can. They have to. So you have to understand that, right? And realize you work on these things together. So that means, of course, most venture capitalists want you to sell your company. They don't want you to go on as a private company forever because they don't get their money back. So that, excuse me, that is one of the complications in dealing with this, and you have to be aware of it going in. Now you'll notice I put technical risks away at the bottom, and deliberately so, because those of us who are scientists tend to believe that what is important is our gizmo, the science, right? Especially when you get professors coming in to talk with you, they just want to talk about their science. And you more or less, as a venture capitalist, you assume they know how to do their science, right? That's what you're not so interested in that. It's what's the market, what's your business model, how you're going to get reimbursed and so on. So in fact, when you're preparing a pitch, usually if it's 15 slides, maybe one should be on the science, right? But that is a little bit of a change for us, a change of mindset for those of our scientists who are used to giving seminars with 20, 30 slides, data slides. In fact, technical risk is usually the smallest part of it. And the major technical risk you see in things is how you scale up, right? You can make one little gizmo, but how can you make 10,000 of them? That's a whole different engineering skill that most people who are inventors don't know how to have. So the major technical risk is the scale-up risk. Okay, now, so this is a pretty formidable list, but now most universities now have put together entrepreneurship classes of different sorts in order to help their students, right? I think now, last I counted it, in the University of California, there were 88 different entrepreneurship programs on the 10 campuses, right? So there's a tremendous proliferation of classes trying to teach entrepreneurship. And the reason, why is this happening? Well, the big reason, certainly the ones I see, is students are demanding it, right? Many students are saying, well, you know, one thing, it's nice to go out and think of myself as being a Nobel Prize winner, but I wouldn't mind being a Mark Zuckerberg or a Steve Jobs as well, right? And so they see that as an alternative. So they're asking their campuses, asking or demanding that they provide the type of training in being entrepreneurship to allow you to answer the questions that was on the previous slide. So, and of course, they're supported very much by the development officers, the people who are the philanthropy people on the campuses, because they realize if any of the companies like these guys all left, they tend to give back. One of the reasons Stanford is so rich right now is the numbers of people who've gone off and started companies. But universities are actually also interested in this, and maybe an area you're less expected. You know, when we teach medical schools, right? You know, and we have medical students. We don't teach with case studies. You put them in a white coat and you put them in the ward so they can actually meet the patients, so that you can actually learn to be a doctor by experiencing it. In business schools and law schools, they still do it by case studies, right? So one of those things, as we're moving on now, is to say, can we actually, and we're working with Haas School and Hastings Business School, to actually give their students hands-on experience in actually forming a real company, right? Which is, of course, much more valuable educational experience and also helps their students get better jobs because they actually know how to do it. And, of course, many of the students will actually go and work for the companies they've helped to set up. So as we try to think, this is another way universities are evolving to try and think how they can come out of their silos, bringing people together across departmental boundaries. Then the other thing that that's making universities much more involved with being supportive of startups is the local economic growth. Now, San Francisco is great right now unless you're trying to rent an apartment. But one of the reasons that it's doing so well is these companies like Apple, Google, Hewlett-Packard, they all started as skunky little startups in somebody's garage, right? Money hasn't come into San Francisco by getting General Motors to build a factory there. It's come in by encouraging startups. So cities and places around the world are realizing putting money, which is very little amounts of money, putting money into helping startups makes economic sense, right? To do that. So let me talk about some of the things that we do in Qb3. Universities in general try to help them. So just tell you a little bit about what we in Qb3 have been doing for a while. So one of the things that we try and do is mentorship. As I said, to try and deal with that checklist, somebody walks in, it's a little intimidating. We don't give out that checklist. Everybody comes in. We provide service individually to people who are wanting to start a company. We expect you to go to Wikipedia and know what a convertible note is and what a Series A, Series B. We don't want to teach you all of that. You can learn that so easily, but get one of those Startups for Idiots books, go read it. That's simple. But once you've actually decided and you need help, individual help to get your own company started, you come to Qb3 and we actually go through that checklist with you and help you try to answer all the questions that are on it. We're currently... And we help incorporate the companies, right? So most people don't know, are you going to a Delaware or a California incorporation? All those things you don't know as a normal scientist. But they're quite trivial as long as you get someone who knows how to do it. So we have these two people, Christine Winotto and Iona, who provide that sort we call startup-in-a-box activities. Currently, we have been incorporating about 70 companies a year. When we didn't realize there would be anything like this demand, but once you started it, it's good. So we're seeing about 2 or 3 a week doing it. What it also means is setting up a banking account, right? And how taking issues like, who do I give stock to? Who gets equity? How much do I take? How much do I give to other people? Those are all trivial questions. What we have are lawyers who will come in pro bono and not charge the people there, and will give their advice, help them incorporate, help them say these are the standards of how you normally share equity. These are not complicated issues. They will do it pro bono because once they've made a connection to a company, you're likely to stay with them. You're not likely to change your lawyers. So this is something we call talent philanthropy. We use that a lot to try and get people who want to use their talents to give back to the university. So we do that and help them with pitch decks. Now, the next thing is when you're starting a company, you really need to have where you're going to get your equipment, right? You've moved out of your university lab and sometimes use great equipment. Now, as I mentioned later, we get some gifts to go in our incubator. But the key thing that we argue here is it's really great to keep startups in the vicinity of the universities because, at least for the University of California campuses, you can go and use that equipment on the university. It's available. You get recharged for using it, but you can go and use a mass spec. You can use these fantastic microscope facilities. You will be charged for doing it, but it's available to outside world. That means you have access to the real state-of-the-art equipment at a very small price, right? Because the universities can't make a profit out of this. Now, why do the universities do this? Well, if you've got a facility, say a microscope facility, and it's only being used 50% time, and you can fill up that, use those technicians for the other 50% time helping companies, so it's a win-win situation, right? So that's one advantage to having startups, although it's sometimes expensive to be close to universities. You have this big advantage. You have easy access to the equipment of the university. That, by the way, turns out to be a very important argument when you're trying to see the value of a state university. We can say, look, we're taking federal money, buying this incredibly expensive equipment, and it's able to be used by all these startup equipments who are going to be companies who are going to grow your local economy. The next thing is you need some place to work. So we, as Claire mentioned, we've run incubators. We've done this in various forms. I'll come back to that in a moment. But currently we have about 80 currently companies, startup companies in our incubator space. Again, we don't subsidize anything. I have no money to subsidize it with. I'm not given any money. So we charge rent for these things. But what we do in the concept here was different. We're trying to get people to start up and use as little, keep their burn rate down as low as possible. Now, if you go to a conventional real estate person, they'll say, oh, we'll rent you out 1,000, 2,000 square feet of space, because that's the smallest amount it's worth their time renting, because they have to do due diligence on you and so on. We're not in the real estate business, right? We're trying to do startups. So we'll rent something about the size of this podium, if that's all you need, and we charge you per square foot. So you're dealing $100 a month or something. So it's a trivial contribution to your startup costs. If there's freezers in our space, right, we will let you rent out a shelf in the freezer for $20 a month, right? So you don't have to buy your own freezer. And if you don't need it next month, you stop paying it, right? So you're trying to also get people very much used to a change from university life where everything is free. You've got to think to the business world where everything costs, right? And to try and get people to think in terms of, I need how much square feet do I need, minimum amount I need, what minimum amount of freezer space is a good educational component. And then we try to help people with seed funding. Now, in this country, we have these small business grants, SBR, STTRs. Almost everyone should apply for those. They're really good. They're just as easy to get as an R01 or an R17. What we do is we run classes in how to apply for those. So people who go through our classes have about 3 times the average rate, 3 times the average in getting funded, right? So you get about a couple of 100,000 for your first year. You make that milestone, you can get millions in your second and third year. Many people can keep their companies going for 4 or 5 years on SBIR grants. Now, the trouble with anything from government is it takes a year for your application before you get any money back. So what we recommend when people talk about starting companies, we recommend that they start a year in advance and get one of those things in. This is something I should have said earlier. One of the big changes that we did in Qb3 was to change the mindset. Most universities are focused on trying to get their professors to start companies, like Langer at MIT, who's fantastic, right? Those professors who are natural entrepreneurs, they don't need Qb3. No, they're doing very well. They were doing well before we came around. They'll do well if we disappeared. Who we want to help are the people who are sort of the reluctant, the ambivalent entrepreneurs who are trying to see, should they go this way? And particularly, I are particularly focused on graduate students and postdocs, right? And helping them start a company. And it makes eminent sense. Since I'm a faculty member, I can say this. It's really hard to work with faculty members. Their egos are so big. They think their science is, I've got this invention. Anything else is trivial. Everything, my idea is going to make this company work. In fact, the idea is about 5% of a company. It's a very small contributing factor. And they, of course, have good jobs, a really soft job being a faculty member. And you're not going to take a whole lot of time off to go and spend time at your company. Whereas students and postdocs, right, they're used to working 24/7. They're used to working on top ramen, right? They're perfect for doing startups because they're used to living on nothing for a long time, and they can therefore keep the burn rate down to make it work. You've been trained particularly for being into a startup. So we try to work a lot with young people here. So we have about 5 different sites where we have these 80 companies are distributed actually in places all over the Bay Area. 6 sites, this was an old site, it's about 80 companies. And each year we bring a lot of money into the local economy. I'll come back to that in a minute. Let me talk a little bit, although you might not be involved in starting up an incubator yourself, it's interesting from my point of view. We've got a lot of scar tissue from getting involved with this, and so I just want to briefly talk about what are some of the constraints in doing startups, incubators. The most successful ones, the easiest ones to run, is if any campus has some unused space that they're not going to use for a couple of years, and if they can get faculty approval, which is the hardest part, they can use that as incubator space on the campus. And they can charge for it, right? You call it. And what we set up, since the people are paying rent, right, to live in it, then it becomes a service agreement, so you don't have to take any you don't have to take the intellectual property. Usually a university will say, if it's done on the university, it belongs to the university, but you can design the space within the campus, which is essentially IP-free space, so that people can keep their own IP. That's crucial to make this whole thing go. But now, so there wasn't, on UCSF, we ran out of space on campus. So we had to go and take an old warehouse, pull it down and reconstruct it. That's this one up here. So we had to do this. How do we do this? Well, actually, I formed a limited liability company, right? And I was the general partner of this. Now, here you think, well, conflict of commitment, especially if you're a university lawyer, these red lights start flashing everywhere. But the way you get around that is I take no money for doing it. It's amazing. When people think about conflicts, they think, oh, I'm going to get extra money. As long as I don't take money, they say, well, why are you doing it? Well, I want to, right? So I don't get paid. So that allows me to get involved with this. So the whole place, which is this one, is 25,000 square feet of space. We have a manager who runs it, property manager, to make sure the trash is taken out and all that. So why does it help? Why shouldn't the private sector put up the incubator? What's the advantage of having a university-associated incubator space? So one of them is that, many people, when they're starting companies, want to be in a university-associated incubator. It makes your company becomes a little bit more prestigious, and it helps you to get money from venture capitalists if you're in a university-associated incubator. Also, I was able to raise money from limited partners to pay for the tenant improvement. We had to raise $4 million. I couldn't get it from the university, so I went out and got investors, and I promised to give them 5% return over 5 years, standard rate, and a little bit equity share. And so we were able to do this $4 million conversion, not on university money, but on things. But the people did it because we were university associated. Because you're university associated, big companies actually give you equipment free, right? So we got about $1.5 million worth of free equipment in that building, all donated to us. Again, it's self-centered, right? The companies, GE puts equipment in there because once you get used to using GE equipment, as your company grows, you'll continue to buy GE. So it's self-interest, but it's nice to get that money here. We also we provide a tenant stream down to this company. And once the companies are in the incubator, we just not want them to get started, we want them to succeed. So success usually means networking, right? Though every small company needs to think about, am I going to partner with a big company who will do a partnership agreement? Am I going to get acquired? Who else might I get money from? So we actually act for these companies to help them be successful, not just to get started here. Now, why should the university do this, right? Why are we involved with having a university-associated incubator? Well, we actually get rent, right, to cover the costs. And although we have 45 companies in this 25,000 square feet of space. We're getting 2 to 5 requests a week to try and get into there. It's a big waiting list to get in. It's a big demand. So we charge rent. We actually make about $1 million a year from this building. So this is great for a Scotsman, to try and do something, actually to make money in this thing. So another thing is, when you get companies want to affiliate to be able to look at those, like the J&J, for example, is a partner with us here. They give us money for letting them look at the companies we have in our incubator. So we get a fraction of that. And a key thing now is we can claim that we are helping the local economy, and all the jobs that's created, all the money that's brought in here from these incubators, we can say this is what the university is doing for the state of California, because we're actually got this partnership. And that gets back to the social contract thing. So, for example, in 2014, this is old data now. These are actually underestimates. So probably we brought in something more like, it created 170 jobs in that 1 year. And the companies we'd been helped, actually, this is low. It's closer to 600 million. So we get $1 million from the state for running Qb3, and we bring 600 million into the Bay Area economy in a year. That's an unheard of return on investment, right? And so that's why it works. So that's about the workshop. Now let's think about venture capital. We got into my own venture fund, Mission Bay Capital. We were able to do this because we were helped by Brook Buyers. So I've been told I have to hurry here. Let me just then get a little beat up. So when you get into venture funds, you have to realize in a Kaufman study, most venture funds don't raise much money. On average, you get a 1.3-fold return. Over 10 years, that's a 3% per year. So that's not very good. You're better going to the bank almost than doing that. So what we did is set up our own venture fund in a similar way. These are the rules we used to put it together. The key thing for doing this, now, when I started this, I had no venture experience. So what we were able to do was to try and bring in a bunch of really talented advisors who give us help pro bono, right? Again, 4 times a year, they help us choose the correct company. And so again, these are the sort of advantages that we get in how we can deal with the conflict of interest thing, having a university-associated venture fund. The way it works is very standard, that 20% profit that normally goes back to the general partners in our first fund. I can't take any money, so that goes to the university. So 20% of the profits of this. So we're using other people's money to generate money for the university in this way. Now that got me involved with trying to work with Janet Napolitano, heard about this, and she says, well, you're doing this great for Qb3. Can you do this for all of the University of California? So that's why I became her senior advisor here. We set up this model of health centers, academic health centers. Oh, we said academic health centers are already a wonderful partnership between universities and essentially a money-making. Hospitals make money, and that's what make the academic health centers good. And so we thought, can't we do this to innovate? Can we do the same thing with an academic innovation center? Academic health centers help local health. Academic innovation centers help local economies. So that's what we pushed very hard. And actually, what I managed to do, I spent some time in Sacramento, and we got this bill through with the help of Representative Jackie Irwin, put $22 million into the 10 campuses to try and help the innovation entrepreneurship things get going. So that we were able to actually show that this social contract idea works. Example of a startup company, 3 graduate students, 2 from UCSF, 1 from Berkeley, started making spider silk in yeast. They can now make kilograms of yeast at the same price as the Chinese make it. We can actually spin it to kilometers in length. They have now 70 employees. They started this 6 years ago, all through Qb3, 70 employees. They turned down a $300 million acquisition because they want to have an IPO, and they're partnering with Patagonia, and they'll have the first spider silk T-shirts on the market probably by the end of the year. So these are some of the areas I think are likely where we're going to see hot startups just now, and ones that I think are less appealing right now. And this is important to know, like cancer immunology, fantastic area, but it's not a place to start up. There are so many startups out there, so many companies in this area. It's too late. You've missed that boat, right? So you don't want to get involved with that. So let me just not get into this, but just go back to then. I said that the whole thing is the science industry is an odd couple. But the nice thing, where the industry and academia actually make sense, is that they both care about startups. We make them and they acquire them, right? So in a sense, startups are their children, right? That's where it comes out of this whole thing. And working together, we can help making a much better trained workforce coming out of it. We can make products from disruptive technologies that would not have come out of natural industries. We've fulfilled the social contract, and hopefully we've convinced the government that we're worth continuing to invest in. Thank you very much.
So I think this is a beautiful example that explains why California is the 5th largest economy in the world, right? I mean, this smart investment by the state to encourage these startups, and the return is huge.
Yeah, well, they're smart. If they invested more, it would be better. But that's all. No, because in contrast, see, Massachusetts has put $100 million into life sciences startups, right? So Massachusetts put a lot more money into this than has California, and that's one of the reasons the whole of the Kendall Square area is really taking off, and our most serious competition is coming from Massachusetts because the Massachusetts government were actually more intelligent than the California one.
So we wanted to open up the floor for questions.
Yeah.
Questions? Kathy.
As part of your organization and looking at the priorities, does your group also provide like FDA regulatory support if they're anticipating a product that they want to get on the market?
Yes. So, by the way, I'm now on my third venture fund, which I'm not supposed to talk about publicly because it's not closed yet, and there's all the SEC requirements on that. But on this one, we have on our board, we have people who specifically have FDA experience, because by the time you get, so that's when the advantage of associating with venture firms, they often have the detailed experience that you need and don't have as a scientist. So this is what we do here.
So in your incubator, you're starting all these companies. Do you have a timeout for the companies that come in? That is there some point at which you push them out of the nest and let them fly or not fly?
Yeah, that's a good question. So do we have a time limit? Now, because that's very important. Before we did this, we looked at incubators around the country, and they are generally disasters, right? And usually they're disasters because they're subsidized and they don't have any time limit. So if you're getting, it's not costing you anything to be there and you can stay there forever, it becomes a geriatric ward, right? And so we try to model that by making it in our situation. It's very hard we try to kick people out at the end of 2 years because you should get a Series A at that point. At that time, you should be up at 5 companies, and we want to be a startup. We want them to move out. So we do that. Sometimes you have to bend the rules a little bit because sometimes companies take a little bit longer, and so it's a judgment call. So we try, yes, we have a 2-year limit, but we tend to be tolerant about it. But it's very important to get people to move out. But if if you're making them pay rent, that usually they will leave voluntarily, right?
Well, I mean, Maryland charged rent, but it was substantially less than what people had to pay if they were in the open market. And so they ended up closing down the life sciences incubator. And I have now 3 companies that I'm incubating in my own company because we had some extra space, which is very helpful to me. They pay my standard rate, so I can at least recover the cost of the areas that they're using. But it was a big shock to them how much it costs to actually live in a private space.
Yes. Yeah, right. Actually, one of the interesting developments is many of the big companies are now, like Bayer in San Francisco, they're actually having a set of their space which was underutilized as their own incubator inside their building, just to try and get some freshness of thinking coming into a large established company. Yeah. Yeah.
So what is your view on spin-outs and tech transfer? Do you take in companies that have problems with tech transfer from a university?
Yes. So tech transfer is a huge issue, as you well know. Let me just say, actually, about 1/3 of the companies that start don't have intellectual property, right? So they often, like the spider silk company, it didn't do it. It did all of, trade secrets and kept it going that way. And they've got them now, but they started off, they had no intellectual property. So you don't have to have it. Negotiating with the universities is a royal pain, right? And the trouble is, and it's not the university's fault, right? The people, no matter what the president of the university says, when you get round to working with the technology transfer officers, they are being told they have to generate their income, right? And that's really hard for them because, if you take equity, you're not going to get any income for 10 years, right? So they have to extract as much money from the company as they can to pay their incomes. Now, where can you extract money? It's very hard to extract money from a startup, right? You can get more from a big company. So the technology transfer offices are, and I know I've talked to them, they really would much rather take your idea and sell it to a Roche than to let you start your own company. It's a really difficult problem. And so one of our huge challenges, and that was on my list of the challenges here, is dealing with the technology transfer thing. Ideally, universities would see technology transfer as part of their service to society. This is part of their social contract. This is part of their giving back. And that's what almost all the university presidents will say. But when you get down to the technology transfer office in practice, no, they have to make their budgets and they will follow this archaic way of doing it.
Go ahead. One last question, then we need to move to the panel discussion.
You mentioned the 88 entrepreneurship classes at the university. Do you really think entrepreneurship is something that can be learnt within an academic setting in a class, or is it, for a lot of people, it's just you either have the knack and the talent for it or you don't and you're never going to be successful?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the best way to do almost all of these things is just to do it, right? You can read all the books you like about entrepreneurship, but just getting in and trying to do it, it makes all the difference. And so what we try to do is to make it easy to do, right? And also try and make it easy to find out if you like it. It's like going through our startup in a box thing. If it turns out you try to write an SBIR grant, you think, this sucks, right? You shouldn't be doing this type of business. So you try to give people, about half the people who go through our SBIR program don't start companies. It's taught them not to start a company. I think that's fine. Right? That's a good thing. And similarly, it's not a big deal. If you want to start a company and work on an incubator and spend a year doing this and it doesn't work, what have you lost? Like a year. And so the best thing is to jump in and see if you like it. Because I agree, I don't think you can really be taught it. It's like trying to teach innovation, creativity. You've got it or you haven't got it. So I think, the best thing is just go try it. Be an experimentalist and see if it works.
Emma, hang on to the microphone because you're coming up. So if I can get the panelists to come up and take a seat up front. Emma Shearling, in the class of the Wellcome Trust class of 2014, is completing her graduate research with Professor Michael Blackman at the Francis Crick and Dr. Lou Miller here at the NIH in the area of infectious diseases, and she's going to host the mentor panel.
So yes, it's my pleasure to introduce our 4 panelists today. Dr. Kelly, I don't think needs any further introduction. So I'd like to start with Dr. Auerbach at the end. He did his bachelor's degree in biochemistry, genetics, and microbiology up at Cornell, and then a master's and a PhD at Yale. He then was here at NIH as part of the NCI as a research scientist, and then went into industry in companies including W.R. Grace and also SmithKline and French. He then began his career in patent law, obtaining a JD degree in addition to the PhD and the Masters and the BS, which is pretty impressive. And that led him to found his own firm, Auerbach, which focuses on the preparation and prosecution of patent applications relating to a whole host of things, including molecular biology, genetics, and therapeutics, just to name a few. Dr. Carol Nacy did her bachelor's, master's, and PhD here in DC at Catholic University of America, and then began her career as a career scientist just across the road at Walter Reed, where she spent the best part of 2 decades studying tropical infectious diseases. She then became the executive vice president and chief scientific officer at Entremed, and then she went on to establish Sequela whilst also being a part-time chief scientific officer at another firm, which is, again, really impressive. And now she remains as the CEO of Sequela, and which commercializes new and more effective treatments for life-threatening infectious diseases. So that's something which is really a cause close to my heart and I think is really exciting. And finally, we have Dr. Schoff, who did her BS in biology and chemistry, an MS in bacteriology, and then a PhD in immunology, so has the whole spectrum there of kind of molecular and life science biology up at UW-Madison. She then worked in the government for the USDA, and then for various other firms, including the Genetics Institute and several pharmaceutical companies. And she is currently the Vice President and Head of Preclinical Development at Dent Biosciences, which looks at ways of generating therapies to modulate the microbiome and the human immune system interactions, which again is really interesting. So please feel free to correct me if I've missed out any vital stages in your career. And I'd like to take the liberty to kind of ask the first question. What was the best or the worst piece of advice that you were given as you made the change from an academic scientist into the wide world of business?
I actually kind of stumbled into it. I ended up taking a postdoc in industry, which was a great way to see what industry was like not knowing. And I was doing parasitology at the time, so it was very unusual that they would actually use a parasite as a model in industry, because I thought I would end up, in veterinary type programs instead. So that was my exposure. It was sort of by chance, quite frankly. And, and that's where I got to see kind of the difference in how people work as a team and kind of that team structured environment rather than personality, and I ended up staying. You know, no intentions of doing so. You know, thought I would do a postdoc and go back to academics. So for me, it was a little bit of luck, if you will. Plus, I did my government stint, so that was my job. But wanted to move back to the Boston area. So mine was a little bit more, that was my path. Circumstances.
Best advice I had, which I got from the guy who started duty-free shopping truck communication, is to think big, right? And that actually turns out to be really useful. When you're trying to raise money, it's almost the same work to get 10 million as it is to get 10,000. You might as well think big on these things. And Bill Rucker, who's the head of Calico, said when he's negotiating with someone, he tries to come in when he says just below the gate of price. You don't want to think, giggle is something that you do what? When you start laughing, you don't want to be there. You come a little bit below, so you're not quite sure it's the truth. You giggle. Thank you. So the worst piece of advice I think I got was to retire. I tried to retire. I got a sailboat and went off with my wife to try and sail down to the South Pacific. And it was really boring compared with doing what I'm doing. So I turned around and came back and worked for Qb3. So.
I've had two different careers, one in science and one in law. I, at some point in 1992, came up with an idea and decided that since I was a patent attorney, I could write my own patent applications on it, and created a biotech company called Replicon at that point, which I then managed for the next decade in parallel with my law practice. Two different things happened. Replicon was started because I followed random instructions from my wife. The law practice developed because of a series of colossal mistakes that I made in my career that ultimately turned out again and again to be advantageous. So I would echo that it was largely sort of a stumbling walk in a maze. Nothing was planned.
That's probably the message that everybody should take away, is that nothing is planned. It's opportunity and being ready when the opportunity presents itself to step forward. So I think the worst thing that happened to me is that no one gave me advice. I was in the middle of a huge midlife crisis after 20 years at Walter Reed, where I had plenty of money, a department of 30. We were publishing 15, 20 papers a year. I had a great academic career, and they don't tell you that if you're 42 and you go into a major depression, that it's just a midlife crisis, and if you hold on for 2 years, it's all gone. So I didn't really like cars. I wasn't a big car person, so I didn't want to buy a Porsche. I actually liked my husband, didn't want to leave him, so I didn't want to get divorced. So the only option I really had at that time was to pick up and leave academia and a very comfortable government position that I absolutely loved and go to a startup. And I actually went on a 3-year sabbatical from the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research. They'd never given 3 years sabbatical to anyone, but I was the senior woman at Walter Reed, and they had never been able to figure out how to say no. I just was so persistent all the time. So I left on a 3-year sabbatical, and in 6 months I resigned. It was amazing to me that if I wanted to start a program, that I didn't have to go through 5 years of hierarchy to get a yes or a no, which would then take 3 years to come back down. So I could start things like this, and if they didn't work, I could stop them just like that. I never had to ask anyone. So I was hooked. And that's how I ended up where I am. And if someone had actually advised me just to hold on for 2 more years, I probably still would have been really happy. But I wouldn't have had the experiences that I had. So.
Is there any questions from the floor?
lots of benefits to being in the startup world and participating in this sort of entrepreneurial culture, but what are some costs? What are some things you give up? I mean, as PhD students, we delay buying houses and having families and owning cars and having our own rooms and our own apartments and things like that. But, I mean, what are some things that you feel you gave up? And, I mean, obviously you all think it's been worth it.
One thing you didn't give up was the science. And I want to be very clear about this. When I actually left to go into industry, it was at a time when people said, oh, she's leaving science. And so my first response to the board of directors when they were interviewing me for this position at the startup was, I'm sorry, but I just want to make it clear that my science and my reputation as a scientist is the #1 issue for me. And I will never do anything to compromise that reputation. And they said, we have no idea what you're talking about. And I said, let's go back and I will tell you again, my scientific reputation and my science at the moment are pristine. They need to remain that way in industry. And they said, oh my God, Carol, we create products for human beings. If we don't do good science, we kill people. Come on, get a grip. So you don't give up the science. You do give up some amount of freedom, and you do give up some amount of basic science. And if basic science is your big thing, then you need to be in a situation in your startup in which you are not directing, but you are providing the background information, and you can manage that.
Yeah, I would think a problem is that your scientific colleagues won't talk to you as openly anymore because they think you might be stealing their ideas. So, you've changed the things. Within academia, we also exchange ideas quite freely. And business world is much more secretive, and so you've lost a lot of that freedom of communication, I think would be one of the big losses.
Yeah, the only thing that I would echo is that the focused execution is what I always say. In the current company that I'm in, a lot of people came in from academia, was their first job in industry, which was also a little bit different climate, say 10, 15, 20 years ago, where you kind of did your stint in big pharma and then you moved into smaller companies. So at least when I was going through it, it would be rare to come in sort of straight out as an undergrad or a postdoc. But anyway, that's how it is now. And I think I always say to my staff is, okay, that's a really good idea, but that's like a postdoc project that's going to take 15 years. I want to get this to an IND filing by the end of this year, so I don't think we're going to be able to answer that. What's the key question that we need to answer to deliver this to a patient? And I think, some people embrace that as a mindset, and some don't. No, I want to find out all these other little pieces. And so that's something to consider.
But you can also manage that process as well. It's the 80-20 rule. It's that way in every laboratory. 80% of your time and energy on what you have to focus on in order to get the job done, and a little bit of playing on the side with science in order to satisfy that curiosity that you'll obviously have.
I don't know how much I can add to that. There's a risk that you undertake, and there's a kind of a responsibility to a lot of other people, your investors, your employees, and it's something that something that I worried about all the time was just, am I leading this company in the right direction to keep all these people successful? So, that's another issue to it. You have to be willing to accept significant risk and significant pressure. That's what
Just one more additional issue. You should probably never give up on your CV. You need to publish. Everybody in my company publishes regularly. As much as I can make them publish, because you never know when your company is going to disappear like that. You want to be able to be flexible and move between academia, industry, and government. And that has proved to be incredibly important for my employees. As we've moved into all clinical stage products, my basic scientist people who were discovering
We don't have the resources anymore to keep them on board, and they've been able to seed themselves into academia and government now because they had a curriculum vitae. The currency of our profession, if you will, are degrees and publications. That's what we're counted on. So keep it up.
That actually raises the question of motivating your people. Everyone, all of your employees have their own career interests and their own lives outside of your business, and keeping them in the fold and happy really requires effort and work all the time. Yeah. So.
Say I'm a grad student or a postdoc sitting in this audience, and I think I have this great idea for a startup, but the professor that I'm working, whose lab I'm working in, is a straight out academic and would never consider, having a startup. How do I deal with that as a student when I have the idea, but it's in a lab that doesn't support the concept of spinning it out into a startup?
So I get this all the time. The key thing comes about, say, patenting. Like if there's a patent, then the faculty member will probably be on that patent, right, with the student on this case. So if a company starts and generates income, in most universities, some of that profit will go back to the faculty member, right? Since I don't actually like faculty to go and start companies, because somebody has to do the work, so the student starts it. What should encourage the faculty member to go on the scientific advisory board, right? And at the same time, then they can get some equity in the company, so they are motivated to make the company work. 20%, 10% equity. So, but they are being a scientific advisor to this company. So in some ways, they've maintained the relationship. You've still got this advantage. So, but if the faculty member doesn't want to start a company, too bad, right? It's not his right. It's if you can go and if you've got the money to get the university to license that patent to you, it's yours. The faculty member can't do anything about it. Actually, that often has happened. And actually what has happened is the faculty members realize they've made mistakes and then later on, some years, ask if they can come back on the company. In fact, this spider silk one, the faculty member wanted nothing to do with it, and he really lost out big time.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. Your best initial play is to negotiate and find a way to bring your faculty member on board. The worst possible play that you can make, in my view, is to go off and patent the whole thing all by yourself. The key issue is having clear title. If you don't have clear title, no one's going to buy your invention. No one's going to invest in you. You'll march in with a lot of work done, and people will say, well, you just don't own that invention, and it'll all just be for nothing. So although it can be painful to work through your faculty member and through the tech transfer offices, there's really no other option. It's really essential.
Okay, I'm going to go for another question. In our kind of OxCam program, we have kind of our very defined mentors who are our PIs for both our projects. How do you go about finding additional mentors that aren't the academic mentors and are the people that are going to be able to lead you into the world you want to go?
Many universities have mentorship programs. MIT has a terrific one, for example. And so the MIT one is it's actually a privilege to be appointed a mentor to MIT students. So people fight for the privilege of getting on the MIT mentorship board. So then you can go and ask to get a mentor. So most of the universities have that. We have about 3 different mentorship programs at UCSF and Qb3. And so you just have, but it's knowing how to access them is the difficulty. And you need to have mentors of all sorts, right? If you if you're a scientist, you need to have mentorship in how to be a business person. But if you're in the medical device space, you need to have special mentorship to know how to deal with the particular FDA regulations and stuff and the market opportunities and problems in medical devices, which are quite different from biopharma. So you have to get domain experts, mentors, and different things. So it's not finding a mentor, it's really getting mentorship in a whole series of areas. Now, if you can get a good mentor who knows how to connect you to the other ones, that's ideal. But I think most universities now run mentorship programs.
Yeah, the only other one I would add is outside of the university setting is, there are a lot of smaller organizations. So say your interest is in inflammation, as an example. You can become a member of the Inflammation Research Association, which is a small organization. It's not your big AAI. They have a lot of mentors. That's actually how I got 3/4 of the jobs I have today, is joining that society, getting involved, volunteering, and learning from this society is built with kind of half academics and half industry people, and so it's a way then to broaden your network outside of just a university setting.
There are also lots of groups out there that are not industry specific. For example, Women in Bio has an enormous presence now. We started with the idea of celebrating women CEOs. They could find 25 about 10 years ago. That was it, 25 women CEOs in all of biotech. And now we have about 180, and the organization has branched out, and any one of us would be a mentor to any one of you, and you don't have to be a woman to be a part of Women in Bio, and you don't have to be a woman to be mentored by someone like me. What you can do is ask. We're here. The reason that we're sitting in front of you is because we're interested in you and what you're doing. And so I have a business card. You are welcome to my business card.
Yeah, I would absolutely echo that. Pick up your phone or send an email to someone you think might help you. And sometimes they won't, but many times they actually will. It's often startling how much help you can get from people just by asking for it.
So can I add a problem that comes up here? I've seen some really bad mentors, and so we don't have a way of Yelpifying our mentors, to try and do that. So the only way around that I suggest to people is you try and have more than one, right? Because if you get, a convergence of advice from people, you can. But if you get divergence, it probably means that nobody knows the answer to that question. So.
So if you're very interested in doing a startup, but you have ideas, but you don't really think those ideas are the best ideas, can you go out and do a startup without a great idea?
I wouldn't recommend that.
I wouldn't either. I had an experience with a startup. It was a really unusual experience. So for startups, mostly we start with ourselves, and we have no money. And we use credit cards, and we gather money from friends in small, tiny amounts. And I think that helps in the creative aspects and focus down on what might work as a business. I had an experience at the American Society for Microbiology. I was the president back in the god-awful 20 years ago days. And they decided to put together a for-profit. And they gathered former presidents and other people who were in industry and said, okay, we're going to give you $8 million, make a company. And we said, well, a company that does microbiology? Nah, doesn't have to be that. Any direction? Nope, just make a company. $8 million later, we folded the company. Yeah. Because it was really hard to try to pick something out of the air that could be a for-profit company with absolutely no guidance and nobody inside with the passion to identify the product. And we were all struggling with what it could be. And we hired 3 different CEOs, and in the end, it's bad to have too much money. It's really hard to have too little money, but it's really bad to be overfunded without your goals already set.
I was trying to think about what would be a bad idea coming in, because it's very hard. It's a judgment call. The ones that we see most often as being bad ideas are people who've got an idea of an invention or a creative, but they're applying it to the wrong market. And particularly when you see people coming in from academia, you know, when we write a paper in our last paragraph, we try and say our results are pertinent to everything from Alzheimer's to toe rot, you know. And so that's how you get your papers published. You've got to completely change your attitude when you go into industry, because they want to say, well, which one of those many things you can apply your thing onto do you think is going to be the most successful? So most bad ideas come with people taking a technology and connecting them to the suboptimal market, or even worse, to too many markets. So, you know, I think it's hard to know what a bad idea is. This is where getting a mentor to try and help you could really be useful.
I'd also suggest, if I can flip your question backwards, if you think you have a bad idea, the next question is, why is it bad? And typically, I mean, one of the fun things in patent law is you get to see the creativity of the human mind. It's amazing. Ordinary people, technically trained people, it doesn't really matter, always come up with new inventions because they have a problem they want to solve. So if you have an idea that's bad and you ask, why is it bad, you can start to guide yourself to something that would be a marketable invention. And
Yeah, the only thing, it's kind of a theme I think everybody has said here, and Reg started it out earlier, that people should really consider is the competitive landscape and who is going to buy your gizmo, as he said earlier. You know, it might be the most wonderful, and I've been in these situations, wonderful scientific idea, but that's not going to make a therapeutic product for many, many reasons. Either the research isn't, you know, baked enough, the competitive landscape is too competitive, kind of like the immunocancer area now is quite flooded. That'd be a difficult area to start something up in. Not impossible, but difficult. So it's at least understanding where your challenges are, your competitions are, and what your market is, and who's going to want this product.
when I started my biotech company, I seriously considered getting a second phone line for my house to handle the flood of calls of people wanting to buy it. Not one person ever called. I had to go out and beat people over the head to pay attention to my work. It's pretty hard to do it.
Yeah. Also, my first company was a company that started out, before we went public, as a company that would take your 5 PNAS papers on this concept that could be a product and translate that into what looked like a product for somebody to fund. And so that's what Entremed was when it first started. And what I discovered over the lifetime of Entremed, which is now 20 years, is that those technologies that had patents and about 20 years worth of basic science behind it worked. And anything that was just a really fantastic idea but didn't have the basic science behind it failed. It just wasn't the right time. And in the patent area, what every patent attorney will tell you is people have a great idea, they patent it, 15 years later, the rest of the world catches up to you with a need for that patent, and you only have 5 years left. So being innovative and entrepreneurial means that you're sometimes a good 10 to 15 years ahead of the rest of the world. Yeah. And you may have to wait that long for people to actually get up to you.
So if I can just like add something. So you see all those TED Talks and stuff about startups, and that the idea is like only 5% of the company, and the rest is the team and the execution and the timing. But I guess in life science, it's maybe a bit different, because life science is so much founded in the idea and in long execution of consecutive good execution of science, right? So would you say that life science is different in regards to other areas that you need a good idea to execute? Or
I mean, personally, I still think it's both. You need the good idea and you need a team to execute, because once again, you can have the most terrific idea, but either the team spreads it too thin, doesn't support it and study it in the way it should, doesn't know the regulatory climate, it doesn't bring it towards the FDA well, and they get shot down. So it's really both things. I don't see life science any different from that. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I was sort of struck by Dr. Kelly's checklist slide, where the science and technology is at the far right corner. I agree. It's an entire package. If you can't execute, if you run out of funding, if you don't have the risk appetite for it, if the market changes, it doesn't matter whether your science is superb. There's a lot of other factors to go into it.
Questions for Dr. Nacy. When you guys were first introducing yourselves and giving your advice when you first started this, you said that your best advice was to be ready when the opportunity came, and I was just curious, is that just the mentality, or is there things that you can do in advance to be ready when the opportunity comes?
I don't actually know, because I think the way I function in my own life is always looking for, always being aware of my environment, so that if there is something that will help my company, I'm listening for it all the time. And I think entrepreneurs tend to do that just as part of their personalities. I probably wouldn't have characterized myself as an entrepreneur at Walter Reed, while I spent 20 years curing mice of diseases I gave them. But it was true that in every instance in which I could see an advantage for my group rather than somebody else's group, I was all over that. So I think, you can train yourself as a scientist to be aware of your environment. You do this every day for your own experiments. It's an interesting concept, and I think that's what will give you the edge in being an entrepreneur. You will see the opportunity because you'll be open to that as a possibility. You're not driven by stepwise processes. I always think of science as having two groups of people in it. There's the A to B to C people. They work well in very large pharmaceutical companies where they have specific and defined things that they do, and they only do those. And there's the A where the F is B, scientists, which is what you are, which are the experimental people who are asking questions that don't have truth as a capital T as an answer. They have truth with a little t until the next set of data comes in, and you're okay with the concept of failure down one road leading you to success down another. So I think that's what you all are. That will give you your edge as entrepreneurs, because that's how you think. You're not worried about risk. You're not worried about process. You're mostly worried about discovering the next small t truth.
So can I just address that a little bit? For me, I think the best sort of preparation, or good preparation, is to know what society needs, right? So you know what people are looking for. And in support of that, they have this fantastic program at Stanford University in medical devices called the Biodesign class. And they have people there for a year doing fellowships. The first sort of 6 weeks of that, you don't think anything. You just find out what is missing in the medical thing. So they go around the hospital, see with a cardiologist, and they make a list of everything that doesn't work well. Like there's not enough sunlight coming into the rooms, anything, right? And so they only collect the problems. Then after that, they try and take those and say, well, which one of those problems can we find solutions for? So one way of sort of, for all of us to be thinking about for companies is to be looking for what is missing in our hospitals and our healthcare thing, and then your mind is ready for when you see the solution to jump in.
The only thing I would add there is staying open-minded. And all of the three biotech companies that I've been in, we started it out in a different disease area, and we ended up somewhere different because the science took us there, and we listened to it. So I think that would be my main message.
Yes, and I think doing your homework about what is needed is critical. And when we started Sequela, Leo Eink and I, two of the founders, went to Africa and to Ethiopia in particular, and went through, and also all around Maryland, went to every public health clinic and asked the question, how do you diagnose TB? How do you diagnose TB? And what are the things that you would like to have if you could have them that would make your life easier? How do you treat TB? What are the what's the advantages of the drugs today? And what things would you like in a drug that was better, safer, more convenient? And after doing that, we came back and actually began acquiring technologies from universities and the NIH and other places to begin thinking about how are we going to cure TB in the future. Diagnostics, critical. Therapeutics, absolutely essential. Vaccine, pie in the sky, maybe.
Talking about, and in theory it's a great idea. How much groundwork do you need to do before that great idea is a patentable idea or a sellable idea, if you get me? Because in biology, you know, you might have a great idea, but it might fall flat on its face when you start running the experimental work.
Well, the fun part of patenting is that there's a fictional component to it. You don't actually have to what's called reduce an idea to practice. If you can describe an idea in a detailed enough manner, that will be sufficient to get you patent protection. It's always good to have data, and it's good to back it up. Having data also tells you whether there's anything in your initial idea that's inaccurate. But you don't need a whole lot of data to start a patent process.
And you can also dump patents. You know,
Oh, yeah.
we do this all the time. We create a patent because we have an idea and we want to make a presentation. We want to protect it before we present. And then in the end, we say, that didn't work. Out. It's costly to have a patent, by the way. That's why the tech transfer people are always looking for a lot of money. A patent runs somewhere between
20,000.
Well, to make a patent, but I have 90 patents, and it costs me about $400,000 a year on the annuities and the prosecution in every country. So it is, yeah, it's a lot. Yeah.
That was just a little reality check, huh?
Yeah.
I've got a question specifically, I guess, for Dr. Kelly. Because one of the things that you said a few minutes ago stuck with me, and it is, say you've got the idea, you talk to people around you, and everyone says, that's such an amazing idea, I'm glad someone's thinking about it, you need to do it, it's a really complicated thing, and it just so happens that this idea is not in your area of expertise, but in what is now a strange interest / hobby that you've picked up while doing your PhD. To what extent, in order to get the credibility, but also in order to be able to communicate with the people who are going to execute this idea, or for you to be able to get in this business, to what extent is it needed for you to have that degree, that expertise? And to what extent is it just needed for you to have the initiative, the idea, and to say, I now need to collect the appropriate people who are going to help execute this? And the reason I'm asking is because I'm doing a PhD right now in biomedical sciences, and the idea for a startup that I have is in psychology and completely outside of my field of expertise. So yeah,
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. You go and find someone who has got expertise in that and make them part of your team when a confidentiality agreement or so on. But also, I think why you should do that very early, because often when you have an idea outside your field, it's not so good actually when you talk to the people who are in the field. And so that's why it's really important to go and check with an expert. It's sort of because they say, well, we tried that 10 years ago, it's an old idea and it didn't work. So that's why going and talking with the experts really helps.
I have a question, kind of the flip side of this is from Pratik, who's actually watching us live somewhere in the UK. How would we go ahead and spin out an idea from our thesis research when we may be tied to IP claims by our university and by the NIH? How do we go ahead and navigate those waters?
Well, yeah, the simplest thing is to go to the tech transfer office and explain what your invention is, and they will then generally take one of two positions. Either they're not interested in it and release the rights back to you, or they'll say they're willing to go forward with it and start a patenting process. But it's not terribly complicated to at least have the initial meeting with the tech transfer office and figure out where you want to go.
And if they say they're not interested in it, is that a warning sign for us to walk away, or is that a, yay, great, we can go off and do it on our own?
Well, not necessarily. The problem is the tech transfer office has limited funding. So they're looking and saying, well, how can we get the biggest invention for the amount of money we want to invest? Also remember, they're drawing upon all the students and all the faculty of the institution. So there are hundreds and hundreds of people coming with ideas. Your idea is unique to you, and so it may have greater value to you. So I wouldn't read anything terribly negative in the tech transfer office's refusal.
No, and you have to trust that they have enough information about your technology to make an informed decision, and they're generally speaking more generalists than specific information, and so it would be reasonable to talk to a patent attorney to ask them briefly, this is my idea, is it so the things you have to worry about is obviousness?
Well, obviousness, novelty. These days, utility is a new issue. Yeah. It had never been an issue for decades, but the Supreme Court recently has revisited the patentability of what are called natural laws and naturally occurring molecules. That's complicated biotechnology. You also need to be able to describe your invention in an enabling way. But assuming that you're interested in going forward, I would call a patent attorney. Virtually all the patent attorneys that I know will give you at least an initial consultation without any cost at all. It's very unusual for someone to charge you initially. And you can perhaps convince them to spend some time researching the patentability of your invention, all at no cost.
And my patent attorneys actually named Sequela. I couldn't figure out a name. We were talking about whether a name is not a big deal. It is terrifying to try to find a name for your company. And my patent attorneys spent probably 3 weeks arguing amongst each other and decided it should be a sequel to Entremed. And then I put a second L in there to make it a feminine sequel. And that's how we ended up with Sequela. But it was all for free. They knew I was starting a company, and they just had a great time doing it. So they're often just delightful people to work with.
If I can make one last recommendation on that, don't go to LegalZoom.
Oh, yeah.
I've seen such disasters from them. Go to real people.
All right, I just had a question regarding the amount of money that people typically raise to start their startups in the life sciences versus other fields. My undergraduate background's in engineering. A lot of software startups require almost no initial capital to start up. That's why it's such an exciting field. There's a lot of young people making these companies. For the life sciences, we've had people from the pharmaceutical industry come here and talk, and for their first successful drug to hit the market, it takes 20 years, and there's many pitfalls in the funding, I guess, acquiring process during that time before they actually get a successful product. I was wondering, in your experience, what's the range of initial capital investment that's required to get these startups started?
Okay, let me just say the last point about this thing, which I think is a bit misleading, that it takes 20 years to get, or 15 years to get a drug to market. That isn't usually pertinent for starting a company. Yeah. And the average time for a company to be acquired is about 5 years in both the medical device and the pharmaceuticals. So you're having an exit within 5 years of formation. So, you're not, because nobody's going to go and start a new Pfizer, right? That's not the way it goes. So that's not an issue. Now, your first point, then, remind me, was the... Oh, how much money? Yeah, if you're doing an app, right, you can do it sitting in Starbucks and do it there, and you just need enough to buy your coffee. If you want to try and do a life sciences company, it depends. If you need a bench to work, you need centrifuges and stuff, it's going to cost a certain amount of money. We, looking at the companies in our startups, and we are only startups up to 2 or 3 people, right? So their burn rate, they're burning through about 200 to 300,000 a year is the average thing. We try and argue that people shouldn't spend more than about 20% of that on rent, usually 10%. But that's about the sort of money you need to get. That's why SBIRs are so useful. They come in at 200,000, right? And so that's why for students and postdocs, if you're thinking of starting a company, it's really good to just incorporate your company and apply for an SBIR, because then you've got a year to sort of, before you finish your training, to see if you get the money. If you get the money, you're set to go. So that's actually the way we recommend is for students is to anticipate leaving to start a company and get an SBIR grant in. But that's about right. I haven't seen anybody who's able to handle much less than a couple of 100,000 a year. Just because supplies actually is one of the things for biological experiments. It's quite expensive. So, by the way, you can go up from there, right?
Oh, yeah.
There's no,
oh, yes. And if you can raise the money, you should raise it when you can raise it.
Yeah.
Never turn down money. It was the first mistake I made with Sequela. We didn't have any technology. We were going to go out and look at TB to see where we could find interventions, and so we raised $980,000 in the first day that we went out to raise capital. And since we had no technologies, I said, oh, well, we don't want to take any more risk money because we don't even know what we're doing. So we stopped it. How stupid. I have been raising money ever since. And that's now 19 years. So for 19 years, I've been pulling my hair out. And I could have started with a whole lot more money had I been smart. So we started with $1 million, roughly $1 million. My first company, Entremed, started with $3 million. So it just depends on what you think you want to do and how fast you can run to get your product moving and how expensive it's going to be. But you guys will be writing grants. You'll know how to do a budget. You'll figure that out. That's how you do an SBIR grant. You have to lay out the milestones and the cost of each milestone. So you'll learn how to figure out how much money you need. It doesn't take that much.
Yeah, it's also going to depend on where you are. So I'm in the Boston area. So there's incubator space there, but it is not cheap. So even renting or doing that kind of quote-unquote economy of if you need lab space, as an example. But remember how costly it can be to contract something out as well. So, it's both of those things. Depends on how virtual you are, what you're doing, what you need. A couple 100,000 seems a little... You don't want to be short-sighted, right? So just as Carol said, you need to outline that plan.
But really, there are 2 types of companies we see. Ones that usually will get going on a couple of million. They're they have a high-risk idea. They're trying to do it. If the idea looks good, right, it's much preferable to come in and try and say get a 20, 25 million Series A, because then that saves you having to spend all your time raising the money. But then it's the venture capitalists who are going to tell you whether you're a 25 million company or a 3 million company at that level. But it is, and of course, Denali just started with a 250 million Series A, but that doesn't happen too often, right? So.
We wish.
Yeah.
Speak loud. I don't know where the microphone.
So this is for the panel. I mean, I've heard us talk a lot about risk, and you have to be willing to take risks. This is what makes for good founders, good entrepreneurs. I'm kind of curious. Firstly, what kind of risk do you really mean? Is it like financial, like emotional, professional?
Well,
all of the above.
Well, let me give you one simple example that I faced all the time. So remember, I had my biotech company and my law firm practice at, pardon me? Simultaneously, yes. And, well, I kind of managed one in the evening, and we had a PhD scientist working, and it was doable. But I got hit. Every time I asked for money, someone would say to me, I don't get it. If this invention is worth $100 billion, what are you doing in your law firm? Why don't you quit, mortgage your house, hire 10 more PhDs, and get this thing finished in 2 years? And my real answer is I just didn't have that much appetite for risk. I had a really nice law practice, and there was no reason to fold it, but it doomed my biotech company. That's what I meant when I talk about appetite for risk.
So someone once asked me what was the best advice I could give people who wanted to start a company, and my answer was marry rich, because it takes a lot of energy and money to get a company started, and you need someone to help you backfill in the rest of your life. So I have 5 kids, and my husband has called my current company, which is still private, my hobby job, because upon occasion, without enough capital to keep the product moving, I will go without salary for a year at a time. So it's your passion. You have to think about this, and the risk is there that you will fail. The risk is there that you will run out of money. The risk is there that you will lose all your friends because you've tapped them so many times, or your husband, although mine has stuck it through. So the risks are very high, but the rewards are amazing. So, and you become addicted to risk. So this is my 3rd company, and clearly I'm addicted. And if I'm old, and if Sequela becomes successful, I'll probably do another company because I really like it. It's fun.
Let me just, my mentor, Brooke Byers, always says that, of course, there's technical risk and financial risk, management risk, all those areas. But what's really important is you identify your white-hot risk, right? What is the thing that, if you don't succeed, is going to destroy your company? And so you have to therefore focus on what your white-hot risk is and not get distracted. It sounds so simple, but many people would rather work on the problems which are easy rather than take on the thing that's going to make is the white-hot one.
And the white-hot one is usually money. Just saying.
Maybe this is a little different way to answer it too. It's also the product that you're trying to go out. So I've come from a company recently that had kind of a couple things in its portfolio. Some are what I would call that low-hanging fruit, something really easy to do, was pretty sure it was going to work, but was not going to be a big profit. Then we had another thing on the other side, which was extremely high risk, but would be high reward. And you need to have that somewhat balanced in your portfolio as well, or getting additional money from venture capital or other further investors down the road can be tricky. There are some that wanted nothing to do with the low return, easy reward, and there were others that wanted nothing to do with the high risk. So kind of balancing that out from a product perspective as well is a good idea.
Going on from that, and also incorporating what you were talking about in terms of social good, it makes me kind of think, if you need a high capacity for risk, are we in some ways just kind of selecting for people who maybe have a large cushion? Do you think this is an issue more broadly, that this is, kind of a little, maybe a closed system, we're kind of feeding back, and, do you see where I'm going with this?
I see where you're going with it, and I'm not I'm not convinced that everybody doesn't have a tolerance for a certain amount of risk, and it depends on your level of tolerance, what you will choose to work on, whether it's low-hanging fruit with a low return, but a return for a public good, or a very high-risk program in which if you win huge, and if you lose amazingly bad. So I think everybody has a level of risk. I think you need to assess your own ability to tolerate risk, and the ability of your family and friends to tolerate that risk, and you'll manage that over time. I think there are a lot more entrepreneurs out there than are people who are willing to take on huge risk. So that would say that they will recycle themselves if they're excited about it, no matter what their level of risk.
I think we have time for one more question from the floor, and there's also one that's just come in from the UK. Soon as we're kind of owned by both the NIH and our UK institution, how do we balance kind of the competing demands and perhaps even, different patent regulations in the UK and in the US?
Jeff, on that one.
I don't really have much more advice than to say to go to the two different tech transfer offices and let them kind of battle it out.
It'll be fun.
Do you actually find that to be true, or you're just supposing that?
This is a question coming from the UK, but we are dual students that have we've been invested in both by the NIH and by our UK institutions. So I suppose it is a realistic problem.
I mean, there's no formal impediment to having two institutions jointly own patent rights. So there's nothing prohibitive about the relationship. It's just a matter of getting the two institutions to cooperate on determining who will take the lead and what the objectives are going to be.
Building One worked on that very issue for more than a year, language in these relationships. So there is language in place, but it always comes down to your unique situation. So what Jeff is saying is exactly right. You sort of just let them battle it out.
Anyone got a last final burning question?
Talked a lot about us building startup companies, and we're all very young in our career, so PhD students or just starting a postdoc. Would you actually recommend someone like us starting a startup company now? Because I have the feeling we're all very good in the lab. We know what we're doing, but most of us really have no idea, how do I lead a lab? How do I lead people? All those skills that develop over time are not there yet. So does it make sense to try and do this step, or should you wait?
There'll be two answers here. You first.
So from what I try, let me just say, I really love basic research. I mean, that's what motivates me, is to try and get long-term funding of basic research. And the thing I just would like to try and push within the university is that all of you sitting out there realize that if something comes up that you think, oh, this could do some benefit to society, then you don't just push it aside and say, oh, well, too bad, I'll go out and have a beer, right? And I think if you're just aware of the fact that, something you're doing may be useful, then you don't have to do it yourself. If you want to you can go find it, find someone who might be interested to do it for you. You can talk to you, make a disclosure to your tech transfer office or something like that. What I want to just push is that it's not enough for us just to say we enjoy the beauty of our science. If it turns out that we have something that can help society, it comes with an obligation to go do something about it. You personally don't have to do it. You might be a terrible entrepreneur, right? So it might not work, but you just trying the idea on somebody else to see if they're interested in doing it. So I just keep your mind open to something. Wouldn't it be good to sort of come up with a cure for Alzheimer's? Yeah.
But even if you wanted to, do you think it's a good idea? So do you have experience seeing very young people trying to build a startup company versus someone who's maybe in the 6th year of the postdoc that they are more successful than the young ones, or do you think it's...
Well, that's why I wanted to put up this example of the people with the silk threads, right? These were people, they got no support from their advisors at all. They were just 3 students, and they decided to do it themselves. They took the risk, they took their time off, and they thought they knew how to solve a technological problem. But, none of them had ever been, initially what they were thinking was making silk for sutures because they were in a medical world. And then, of course, as they just over time learned how to be business people. So they just jumped in and did it. So I think it's just try it. If you I think it's just for yourself. I mean, you would know. Does it make your juices flow? Do you get excited thinking about starting a company and with this idea? Because it's going to be painful, right? That checklist was to try and remind you it's not easy to do, but the rewards are fantastic if you can do something to help society. So I don't know if that's quite answering your question, but maybe we can catch you later and follow it up.
So I'm going to give you a different perspective. If you're starting a company to be acquired or to have the technology moved out of your company on a licensing, okay, you can start it at any time. If you want to build a company, it would be better to be more seasoned scientifically and to look for situations in which you can learn how to create a budget, manage the budget, hire and fire people, and manage a group of people. So it was easy for me coming from Walter Reed, having run a department where I knew that there were HR rules. I mean, just even knowing that there are rules is important. And that I had submitted budgets and I had kept to my budget over time. And I knew how to hire and fire people and to manage postdocs and technicians. All of that is important information that is translatable directly to business. And so I didn't go to business school after getting my PhD. I just learned seat of the pants. I went to a startup company as the chief scientific officer and the second person that they hired after the president, and learned from that president and the chair of the board how to set up a company. And then in my usual arrogant way, set up a company right after we went public, and that's Sequela. And had I known how much there was to do in Sequela that I hadn't learned yet, I probably wouldn't have started it at the time. But it's one of those see one, do one, and then teach one. So now I'm here to tell you, you ought to at least see what it's like in a small company. It's very intimate. And then you can start one once you've figured out what the process is about equity and this, that, and the other thing, and that whole list that Reg gave you. And then you can stand in front of the next group of people to tell them, be sure you have your curriculum vitae together, that you have good publications so that you're scientifically credible to your investors, to make sure that you have enough experience in running a laboratory that you're not, for the first time, having someone work for you. You won't be able to start a company and be at the bench full time. It doesn't work that way. So.
Can I just add one other thing? I notice almost all of our companies are started not by individuals, but by teams, 2 or 3 people. And so when you're going finding if you can get other people who've got complementary skills and that you like working with, because working with a team is really fun. I think one of the big examples for me is, Genentech came from my department. Herb Boyer, he learned how to clone DNA, but he was a complete flake. I mean, he would never have started a company in his life. He was a classic hippie, but he ran into Swanson, who was a person with the venture capital experience, and when Swanson and Boyer got together, they were able to do it. So the key thing, looking around to find a team, putting together a little team, one, it's fun, and secondly, it makes a lot of sense.
I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all 4 of the panelists for their incredibly insightful and honest answers to our question. I know, sorry to cut the discussion short, but we're sure we're going to have the opportunity to interact with them in small groups. So I'm sure we've got a ton more questions to be answered. So thank you.
And I also want to thank Emma for hosting the roundtable. So thank you, Emma. Let's see. So I promise you we are going to take about a 5-10 minute break since we've not had a break yet. But I wanted to put this slide up, and you'd think I would have planted the last question because it's perfectly going to lead into what we'd like to discuss at the roundtables today. So one of the things you guys have asked is to be able to have more intimate conversations with our panelists. So what we're going to do today is have 4 tables set up, and I think you've all been assigned to a table, and each of the panelists is going to sit at the table, and you're going to have discussions about what this word is. We sort of got the big picture today, and I figured that's the way that it would go. That it would be, everybody thinks about this word and they think, oh, it's building a company. But it's not necessarily that. You guys can all be entrepreneurs in your lab right now. And that's being creative and thinking outside the box, bridging collaborations, that spirit of innovation. So what we want to do in the roundtables is discuss with these experts how they became entrepreneurs in different stages of their career and how you can do things now to improve your training, that you'll become a person that can build companies if that's your desire.